Hey everybody. So since we touched on it in class last week, I wanted to take a few minutes of this week's class to talk about responsive design, particularly to talk about grid systems. We touched on this as well when we were talking about mobile and web apps. We talked about the Financial Times and the Boston Globe using responsive web apps as a way to sort of increase the viability of their site across multiple platforms. And so I want to touch on this because we really haven't spent any time on CSS. And one of the reasons for that is partly because there's a lot of sort of accepted systems for how to lay out news websites at this point. And you're going to see this reflected pretty much in any news website that you visit, in most websites that you visit, period, because if they're generated by something like WordPress, Tumblr is actually a notable exception in this. They're going to be based on a grid system. And a grid system is not exactly a grid system. It's usually actually a system of columns, but there are some horizontals that come into play, and so we naturally call it a grid. But you'll recognize very quickly as you look at this. For example, obviously today we have the Boston Marathon, so there's a lot of news happening. But I just want to show you, just sort of take a critical look at some of our, some common newspaper websites, and it may not off the bat look like there's a real sort of column system going on here until we start scrolling down the page. And what you'll see is that one of the most common grid numbers is 12. It's easily divisible. It has a nice potential for sort of rhythm and flow of different shapes and sizes along the length of the page. It also helps accommodate standard ad sizes, which is another thing that makes it attractive to news design, just to news design in general. So what you can see here is it looks like, first of all, at the top of the page here, that I have about 2/3 and 1/3 of the page, right? It's split into thirds with a 2/3 and a 1/3 in the first layout. As we scroll down, we actually see these thirds expressed more directly, right? We have a small vertical stroke here. We see some margins, and we can see it's about a third, a third, a third. If we keep scrolling down the page, eventually we come to sections where we start to see this broken actually into sixths, right? So we have, two columns, two columns, two columns, two columns, and then 4 columns altogether. Now, I'm sort of eyeballing this and guessing, but I'm pretty certain, frankly, just even looking at this website, that this is based on a 12-column grid layout. The same thing that we can see here at the New York Times. This is probably also a 12-column layout, where we might see 1 column here. This looks like it might be about 5 or 7 columns, and then another 4 columns over here. This width is about twice this width, right? So there's a lot of ways to mix this up, and obviously, the decisions that, we can go to, say, the LA Times. But what we see is that this is repeated all across news websites. Most of your WordPress layouts, right? Again, what we're seeing here is a column layout. And so one of the reasons why we haven't talked a whole lot about CSS in terms of doing layout is partly because most of the time you're going to be fairly constrained, and you're going to be wanting to look for a grid system. So since we talked about responsive design, I just want to sort of reflect for you guys how this process would work. Now, I have there are a couple of resources that I've used for this. Oops, oh, that didn't work the way that I expected. So one was, I just Googled responsive grid system, and I came across this. CSS has a lot of libraries that people publish for free, the same way that we've seen with jQuery. People do publish a lot of JavaScript libraries for free. And so this is called Responsive Grid System. I played around with this a little bit. It's a pretty good one, and this is really going to leverage CSS. I know that we've addressed classes in brief. When I say classes, I mean CSS classes in brief. We've done a lot of targeting of content based on div names. This is where we start to see the power of classes, because if we want to constrain content to being in only a third of the page, or only a quarter of the page, or the fifth of the page, or say multiples of these, having this grid system and then using the class names can define all of the things about it that we need to, like the text color, the background color, the borders, if any, fundamentally just the width on the page, so that things flow nicely. And we can see in this example that as we squish this up, right, we start to see things stack a bit more. And this one actually, until you get pretty small, that's once you get really small is when it starts to stack things vertically. So this is an example of a responsive grid, and we'll take a quick look at how this works. There's another system called 960 grid, which is typically a non-responsive grid. And this helps you construct grids as well. There's a grid overlay bookmark, which is really handy. Let's see if I can get this. So if I add maybe that's what this was, but I think it might be, this one might be broken. So in theory, if I take this and I run this bookmark, right, this is actually showing me a grid system over the existing page. It might be a little bit difficult to see on your screens there, but it's giving me a way to sort of test out and see if maybe this is a gridded site. So I'm going to show you the responsive one just because we've talked about that. But basically the long and the short of it is that in each of these cases what you're going to do is you're going to download a bunch of JavaScript and CSS. I'm going to remediate that JavaScript and CSS. And use it, by which I mean I'm going to edit out the stuff that I'm not using. So, I mean, I have a sample here where I could just download a 12-column grid, but this is a little confusing to me, so I'm actually going to download the zip file of absolutely everything here. And if I come to my target folder, I have my InfoViz folder here. And I have a folder called Responsive Rollovers. I'm going to save it in there. And just go ahead and unzip that file, and I'm going to get a series of folders that I'm just going to go ahead and bring up to the top level here. Okay, so all I'm doing is moving around files here. Nothing has happened yet. I'm going to get rid of that container folder and also the original zip file, just to sort of clear things out. And now I'm going to move over to Aptana and take a look at this. So I'm going to, I sort of already had a folder there and made it into a project. And you can see that I have this thing called responsive rollovers, and that's because actually the main thing we're going to focus on this week is going to be generating rollovers using jQuery to do rollover adjustments, so that we can have, for example, instructions appear on rollover and disappear when someone rolls out, right? Some of the context we were talking about from Friday and relating to Friday's reading. So I'm just going to go ahead and open this up here, and I'm also going to open it up in a local browser window, right? So we're back on the desktop as we were early on in the semester. I'm going to go ahead and open this in Chrome, and it's going to give me a warning because how could I download a page from the internet? Crazy. So I downloaded the full system, which is not what I want. I have decided that I am going to do a 12-column system. So first of all, I'm going to get rid of the other examples, and then I'm going to play around with the ones that are left. So you know, I could have just decided to grab just the 12-column version if I had wanted to. I like to sort of work backwards, and this is advice that I have given some of you all in your final projects as well, which is that if you want to use something that you're not familiar with, the best thing to do is take a working example and then sort of reverse engineer it, right? So I've just started here by deleting everything, what I believe is the divs for all of the examples that are not the 12-column example that I want to use. So having done that, if I reload this page, I now have just my 12-column examples. There's also this footer down here that is, you know, the person who made it. We should definitely give this person credit. So what I'm going to do is just grab that somewhere in here. So, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and put this in my header. And actually there may be a credit already up here, but if there isn't, he should have put a header, he should have put a credit up here. But so I'm going to go ahead and say, you know, with thanks to creator, right? Got a stray tag in there. Right, so I've gone ahead and made sure that I'm crediting the person in my code who I pulled this from because it is very valuable to me and I'm grateful for it. So just to make sure I'm not deleting anything I don't want to. So you see what I'm doing here. There was he created a tag called footer, which may be a recognized HTML tag these days. I'm not honestly sure. I just want to make sure that I'm only deleting the things that I ought to be deleting. And you can see down here that they're loading some JavaScript. I don't actually want to do this because I have my own JavaScript loading that I'm going to do, my own jQuery loading. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. They've got some other stuff in here that I am not going to worry about, so I'm going to just delete that. And we'll see if it's broken when I'm done. So here I will come back to this guy. This is looking pretty good. It has that giant text at the top, of course, which don't really want. So I'm going to remove that and just say, test content here. Okay. And I think that I have probably, now I have all these extra style sheets that I'm potentially pulling in here. So I want to get rid of those since I'm, again, only using the 12 columns. Now it's not going to produce a visible change. But it will clean up my page here. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is just kind of play around a little bit with this. So from the documentation, I can say call span 1 of 12, or I can say 2 of 12, right? And if I say 2 of 12, then I want to delete one, right? Because otherwise I'll end up with too many columns. So basically the sum of all of these little div 1s or 2s or 3s or 4s needs to be 12. Which is kind of a convenient way to do it. So if I make that a span of 4, then I need to get rid of 3 other divs, right? Because I've kept 1, I'm deleting 3. And let's just see how that looks. Pretty good, right? So basically what I can do is I can now start to think about making sections of content where I just say, band section 1, and do another one. He even uses the div ID main content, which is one of my favorites, I have to say. And I can create another one called band section 2. Right? Now how, of course, would we control the height of this? We would still need to do direct height on those CSS elements, which is what you guys are going to do in your final projects. You might have a 2-column wide section that runs a story down it. You might have then a 6-column wide section with one of your interactives or an image. You might have a small sidebar on the side, right? So as you start to think about how you're laying out your content, you can think of it in this context. And as we saw before, right, it doesn't obviously, it kind of just squishes for the most part until you get here. Now, a lot of desktop sites don't actually function responsively, which I kind of prefer because I think it's a little weird, but it's not so bad. I mean, I think that this one doesn't actually sort of snap content until you get pretty small with it. And, obviously it's up to you all. You're welcome to use the 960 grider if you prefer for a more fixed grid layout. But either way, you can use it as a way to generate the fundamental CSS that you need to get a web page that looks pretty nice without doing a lot of overhead work. So that was to just sort of introduce you guys to that. In the next section, we're gonna do a little bit of work with generating clicks and rollovers and all of that stuff. So we will see you in a minute. Okay.